A knock echoes through a silent street. Behind the door, an entire family lies sick with plague. The father's neck bulges with black swellings. The mother coughs blood. Children burn with fever. Someone must enter that house, examine the dying, and somehow walk back out alive. The plague doctor arrives wearing a mask shaped like a bird's beak, a long waxed coat, and leather gloves. He carries a wooden cane to avoid touching anything directly. Everyone in the street steps back as he passes. This man walks among the dead and dying daily, yet he expects to survive. How did medieval plague doctors protect themselves from the most contagious disease in history? And why did some live while most of their patients died? Before we uncover the strange protective rituals that stood between doctors and death, if you're fascinated by how medieval medicine confronted its greatest nightmare, subscribe now. The most bizarre part is still ahead. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population within 5 years. Subsequent plague outbreaks occurred regularly for centuries, each one bringing panic, death, and desperate need for medical care. Regular physicians fled cities when plague struck. They understood that proximity to plague victims meant death, and they chose survival over duty. Plague doctors emerged to fill this void. They were physicians, surgeons, or sometimes less qualified practitioners who agreed to treat plague patients when others refused. Cities hired them under contract, offering high pay, housing, and legal protections. The compensation was generous because the work was essentially a death sentence delayed. Many plague doctors died within weeks or months of beginning their duties. But some survived. Records show plague doctors who worked through multiple outbreaks over years or even decades. These survivors became famous. Their techniques studied and copied. Their survival wasn't random luck. They followed specific protective protocols that, while based on incorrect medical theory, accidentally provided real protection. The iconic plague doctor costume emerged in the 17th century, but its elements existed earlier in various forms. The purpose was to create a barrier between the doctor and the poisoned air believed to carry plague. Medieval medicine operated on miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, corrupted vapors rising from decay, filth, or the sick themselves. If plague spread through air, then preventing that air from reaching the doctor's body became the primary defense. The costume was designed to seal the doctor away from contaminated atmosphere. Every element served this purpose, even when the reasoning was wrong. The beak mask was the most striking element. The long beak, filled with aromatic substances like dried flowers, herbs, camphor, or vinegar-soaked sponges, functioned as an early air filter. The doctor breathed through the beak, and the aromatic substances were believed to purify the corrupted air before it entered his lungs. Glass or crystal eyepieces protected the eyes from poisonous vapors. Did this work? Not in the way doctors believed. The plague spread primarily through flea bites from infected rats, though pneumonic plague could spread through respiratory droplets. The beak mask didn't filter bacteria or block fleas, but it did create distance. The long beak kept the doctor's face farther from patients, reducing exposure to respiratory droplets in pneumonic plague cases. The eye protection prevented contaminated fluids from entering through mucous membranes. Accidentally, the mask provided partial protection despite being designed for the wrong reason. The heavy coat, usually waxed or treated with oils, covered the doctor from neck to ankle. Leather or thick fabric, sealed with wax, created a semi-impermeable layer. Plague doctors believed this prevented poisonous air from penetrating their clothing and reaching their skin. In reality, the treated fabric made it harder for fleas to bite through the material and slightly easier to clean contaminated surfaces off the coat later. Gloves, often leather, protected hands from direct contact with patients and infected materials. The wooden cane or stick allowed doctors to examine patients, point to symptoms, or move objects without touching them directly. This reduced direct contact transmission, though doctors didn't understand that concept. They simply knew that touching plague victims often led to infection. Before entering a plague house, doctors prepared themselves through purification rituals. They burned incense or aromatic woods, believing the smoke drove away corrupted air. They rubbed their hands and exposed skin with vinegar or rose water, substances believed to resist corruption. They sometimes chewed garlic or held herbs in their mouths. Modern understanding reveals accidental effectiveness. Vinegar has mild antibacterial properties. Smoke created an environment fleas avoided. The rituals, while based on wrong theory, created barriers that occasionally prevented infection. Inside the plague house, the doctor worked quickly. Prolonged exposure increased risk, so examinations were brief. The doctor checked for bobos, the characteristic swellings in neck, armpits, and groin. He noted fever, the appearance of black spots on skin, coughing blood, or other symptoms. Treatment options were limited and largely ineffective, but diagnosis determined what happened next. If the entire household was infected, the house might be sealed, the door marked with a cross, and the family quarantined inside. Guards prevented anyone from leaving. Food was left outside. The family either recovered or died together, sealed away from the healthy population. Plague doctors recommended treatments that ranged from useless to harmful. Bloodletting was common, based on humoral theory. The doctor would lance a vein, draining blood believed to be corrupted. This weakened already dying patients, hastening death rather than preventing it. Lancing buboes was another standard treatment. The doctor cut open the swellings, draining pus and blood. This was agonizing for patients and dangerous for doctors. The procedure released infected material into the air, increasing exposure risk. Sometimes patients survived after lancing, not because the treatment worked, but because their immune systems overcame the infection despite the interference. Herbal preparations, poultices, and prayers rounded out the treatment options. None cured plague. The best a plague doctor could offer was comfort care, pain management through opiates when available, and spiritual preparation for death. After leaving a plague house, the doctor followed decontamination procedures. The coat was fumigated over smoke. The mask was cleaned with vinegar. Gloves were replaced frequently. Some doctors bathed entirely in vinegar or rosewater, believing it protected them from infection absorbed during their visit. These rituals had mixed effectiveness. Fumigation might kill some fleas on the coat's surface. Vinegar might kill some bacteria. But mostly, the rituals provided psychological comfort. The doctor felt he was actively preventing infection, which gave him courage to continue work that terrified everyone else. Diet and lifestyle modifications were believed to strengthen resistance to plague. Doctors avoided certain foods thought to corrupt the humors. They drank wine, believed to be protective, and consumed expensive spices thought to resist disease. Wealthy plague doctors could afford these precautions, poor ones couldn't, and died more frequently. Some plague doctors developed personal theories about protection. One might believe that constant movement prevented infection, so he never stayed in one plague house longer than necessary. Another might think that certain herbs were more effective, so he packed his beak mask with specific combinations. These personal systems, refined through survival, were passed to apprentices or recorded in medical texts. The ones who survived multiple plague outbreaks were studied by others. What did they do differently? Did they have stronger constitutions? Were their protective rituals superior? Or were they simply lucky? Modern analysis suggests several factors contributed to survival. Doctors who maintained distance, even when wearing masks, reduced exposure. Those who worked quickly and avoided prolonged contact with patients had better odds. Doctors who changed and cleaned their protective gear frequently prevented accumulation of infected materials, and some were likely naturally resistant or had survived previous plague exposure, gaining immunity. But many plague doctors died despite precautions. The job was fundamentally dangerous. No amount of beak masks, vinegar baths, or herb fumigation could completely eliminate risk. For every doctor who survived years of plague work, several others died within weeks. The mortality rate among plague doctors was high, but not as catastrophic as among the general population. Regular citizens died at rates of 30 to 60% in severe outbreaks. Plague doctors died at perhaps 20 to 40%. Better odds, but still terrible. The protective measures provided some benefit, though not as much as doctors hoped. Cities struggled to recruit plague doctors because of the obvious risks. Contracts offered substantial pay, but money meant nothing if you died before spending it. Some plague doctors were convicted criminals offered freedom in exchange for plague work. Others were foreign physicians lured by desperate cities. A few were idealists who believed medical duty outweighed personal safety. The psychological toll was severe. Plague doctors witnessed horrific suffering daily. They entered homes where entire families were dying, children crying beside dead parents, people begging for help that couldn't be provided. They knew most of their patients would die regardless of treatment. They lived with constant fear of infection, wondering if each headache or fever was the beginning of their own death. Some doctors drank heavily, using alcohol to numb emotional pain and steady nerves before entering plague houses. Others became deeply religious, seeing their work as divine calling. A few developed callous detachment, treating patients as medical problems rather than suffering humans. Community attitudes toward plague doctors were complicated. They were necessary, desperately needed during outbreaks, yet feared and sometimes hated. People associated them with death because they appeared when plague struck. Children ran from them, adults crossed the street to avoid them. Plague doctors often lived in isolation, separate from healthy populations. They had designated lodgings, ate alone, and socialized rarely. This isolation was partly protective quarantine and partly social exclusion. No one wanted to be near someone who spent days among plague victims. When plague outbreaks ended, some plague doctors were celebrated as heroes who had stayed when others fled. They received honors, bonuses, and public recognition. Others were quietly dismissed, their services no longer needed, the city eager to forget the horror they represented. A few plague doctors became wealthy from their work. Multiple contracts with different cities during different outbreaks, combined with high pay, created substantial savings. These doctors retired comfortably, living off income accumulated through years of death-defying work. Others spent their earnings quickly, assuming they wouldn't live long enough to need savings. They bought luxuries, supported families, or donated to churches, enjoying life while they still had it. The techniques plague doctors developed influenced later medical understanding of contagion and protection. The idea of protective barriers, even crude ones, planted seeds that eventually grew into modern infection control. The observation that some protective measures worked better than others led to experimentation and refinement. When germ theory finally emerged centuries later, researchers looked back at plague doctor techniques with new understanding. The beak masks didn't purify air, but distance worked. The treated coats didn't block miasma, but impermeable barriers prevented some transmission. The fumigation didn't drive away evil vapors, but it killed some vectors. Medieval plague doctors were wrong about why their protections worked, but right that protection was possible. They walked into plague houses and sometimes walked back out, not through magic or divine intervention, but through accidental barriers that blocked transmission routes they couldn't see or understand. How did medieval plague doctors treat patients without dying themselves? They sealed themselves in beak masks and waxed coats, creating barriers between their bodies and air they thought was poisoned. They kept distance with wooden canes and worked quickly to minimize exposure. They fumigated, bathed in vinegar, and followed rituals that accidentally prevented infection despite being based on false theories. They died anyway, many of them, but not all. Some survived through luck, some through natural immunity, and some through careful adherence to protocols that worked for reasons they couldn't comprehend. They were heroes operating in darkness, protecting themselves from an invisible enemy using visible armor that occasionally, against all odds, actually worked. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.